Hey, welcome to another expert interview. Today's guest, it's amazing. We're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is marketing. Everybody asked me questions there, and it's fun to now be the person asking questions. And so, Dan, I'm excited to have you, man. Hey, I always let my guests just explain who they are and what they do because it's easier than me trying to do it. So, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, short version. I grew up in the inner city of Detroit. I watched my dad start two businesses, Devin, and they failed. I was 10 the first one, I was 14 the second one, and I watched a guy who, like a lot of people, are hard workers, would give their shirt off their back, work to mornings, noon, and night to get things done to, try to meet people's needs, and then those businesses failed. And thankfully, my dad introduced me to personal development. We went through all kinds of stuff, like with, bankruptcy and welfare. And, I remember when I was an athlete at 10 years old, right after the first business situation, there was a time I was playing youth football that I couldn't even play football because my dad couldn't, our family couldn't afford to get me a pair of cleats, to give you an idea. And thankfully, a guy named Jerry Sanders just extended generosity and, hey, kid, here you go, and gave me a shot, right? And so my dad opened a lot of doors like that also, where he introduced me to personal development, led to marketing. My sister got me a job in direct response marketing back in the late 80s, Devin. And I got fascinated by like the human psychology and like why people buy, or like how could they see a commercial for 30 seconds and like buy X, whatever X would be, right? TV, radio, direct mail. And I started taking a deep dive, and I got introduced to people like Tony Robbins and Brian Tracy and Tom. And I started studying this stuff while I was still in college, playing college ball. Then I played some semi-pro ball, but I was still studying and fascinated. And then I started my first company in my senior year. I dropped out, or I finished the baseball season, and I stopped going to classes. And I started my very first company. And since then, I've been running companies for over 30 years now, and have helped work with over 5,000 founders and CEOs from a whole variety of industries, 100, probably 180, 190, 200 industries, 13 countries. And it's just been fun. I've also been fortunate, Devin, to grow two of my own companies, well over 8 figures, that I sold and exited. And now people come to us and go, hey, can you show us how to do what you've done? And so it's a joy to be able to do that.
That's awesome, man. Thank you for taking the time. I know when we met the first time, I was geeking out on how tactical you are, how deep into the systems you get. Like it's super fascinating. What is the biggest trend you're seeing in marketing? Let's just jump in because we were talking about this before we hit record, but like where are you getting drugged into conversations with your clients?
Yeah, I think, where we see a lot of challenges, is, we see a lot of people who've tried either agency work, right, working with somebody and it didn't work, or they tried doing it on their own or having a staff and it didn't work. And, what is it didn't work mean? And so common themes we see, Devin, I don't know if you guys see these, but one of the common trends is they feel, golly, I've got so much that I can give people. And if they just knew what I could do for them, I would change their life, right? Whatever their service or product is. And there's that, like that being stuck, if you will. Also a lack of clarity around like, what's my plan to really do this we'll call it the future of business, right? With AI being introduced and technology and things just evolving like literally, in a month, what it used to be 5 years. So fast. And how do you keep up when you're a small business? Other trends we see are, golly, I feel like the world's best kept secret, right? Or I'm kind of invisible in this, larger pool, or so they think they are. So how do we conquer that? Another one is, they have inconsistent leads, or they feel like a lot of low quality leads or inconsistent sales, or they're the one, golly, my team can't sell like I could sell. And another one is then, I don't want to scale this because scaling this means I'm going to have 10 times more work, right? Which is not fun for anybody. So those are a couple of the common trends we have that people are kind of, and I think AI is, I don't know if you feel this way, Devin, but I think AI is kind of contributing a lot to the anxiety around this, because people hear and they see all these people. And, one of the biggest challenges, I think, is people get in this comparison game of, they don't realize that some of the bigger names in the world are investing like $1 million plus a month in what they're doing. And they're trying to do it on $1,000 budget. Like, there is no comparison. And like, to try to model that, it's like that tip of the iceberg stuff, whereas if they're trying to model somebody that's got this $1 million a month model versus, where they're really at, it creates, and then they get frustrated and disappointed. And so really slowing the game down, I think, is one of the things we're really good. I think you're really good at is slow the game down so you can speed the game up. And then you got to trust the process, right? Because it is a process. Knowing enough about you and Steve and the people you work with and the partnership models, like it's not a question of if it works, it's a when it works, right? And so if you could trust the process of the when, and it can take, for some clients, it can take 30 to 90 days, and other clients, because you get up under the hood of their car, as you probably know, and it's a little more messy. They don't have the infrastructure. They don't have really a great foundation. They're not clear on their client profile, and, we'll call it the avatar, or beyond, we call it beyond the avatar, or their roadmap or their offer, and all those other things that are really critical. Well, what happened? That can lengthen the process. But if they just will commit to it, it's a when it's going to work. It's not a question of if, because it's very systematic, it's very predictable, and it's also very scalable if they stay on the path, if you will. So those are a few things, David. Yeah.
Love it. I love that. I love your answer because it goes to one thing I was going to talk about, which is the noise in marketing, right?
Oh, yeah.
Or the shiny object syndrome, or whatever analogy you want to use. I think what I find in the marketing world so often as a small business owner is they're just overwhelmed, right? Like they're overwhelmed with their own mindset, which you mentioned some of the sticking points and things they're contemplating, but they're overwhelmed with decisions. And then they've been burned. Like it's rare to talk to an SMB that hasn't been burned by a marketing agency. So first, let's talk about filtering the noise. Like when you're working with clients, how do you help them filter the noise and figure out like what is the right strategy? What is the right approach? So talk to me about that. How do we sift through the noise?
Yeah. So as you're watching right now, or you're listening right now, one of the simplest things, first of all, is you got to start where you start. That's a really critical thing. Again, stay away from it. So step one in our model and our direct response branding methods that we work with in this process, Devin, is you get clear on the vision and growth plan, right? And again, and stay out of like trying to compare creating your vision and growth plan compared to XYZ. It can be as simple as like 5 sentences on a sheet of paper. Like it's still today, most of my vision and growth plans start as little stick figures and little boxes on a thing that I draw arrows from. And then that gives me clarity. And then I kind of take it and evolve, right? So map it out. So we call it step one is the vision and growth plan. Why? It keeps you out of limbo. It brings clarity on the path, right? It helps move from one step to the other. And I think when people have that, and staying out of the of limbo, staying out of the dark, it just helps, right? The simple things, like lots of people, as we know, they talk about values of their business. Like values, I think, are so critically important. The way we do it anyway, I think the way you do it too, is alignment with your value-based selling, values-based marketing, value-based communication, right? Not the kind of values that most people do, which are like platitudes on a wall that they review once a year in their team huddles, but like things that are, simple 3 to 5 key things that are true all the time in the business and are reflected on like probably daily, weekly, monthly, over and over, and all decisions can be made and filtered through values, like starting even, hey, what are our 3 to 5 true core values as a business? And then communicating those, and then starting to build your models around those things. Another version of this is, okay, what is the path for our marketing? Most people don't have a path. They follow a lot of outdated info, and we can get into that in a little bit. So like write it out, like what is your path for marketing, and maybe why, right? Lots of people are missing usually 2 of what we have explored to find the 5 most critical ingredients every brand, big, small, or anywhere that's successful uses in reviewing over 5,000 companies, including the NFL and Apple and Nike, and then small businesses that we've been fortunate enough to work with over the years, right? Is just start mapping it out. Like, what is that path? And then that's marketing, but then the separate side to map out also is the sales process, right? And then ultimately your fulfillment process. And it can start again with 1 sheet of paper and mapping it out. And you don't have to get too overdone, like you said, overwhelm or burn out, or be a mad scientist about it and lock yourself in a room for a month and then feel like you have to close off everything and be tense. Keep it simple. So vision and growth plan, I think, is the number one thing that helps people get clarity And if you don't have the ability, work with someone, whether it's someone like Devin, someone like us, or find someone that's an expert at helping people architect these sorts of things and map it out. Like when you map it out, like it just simplifies the game. Yeah.
I love that. And I love that you talk about kind of slowing down and getting out of it. I think a lot of people are making those decisions, like you mentioned AI, right? Like, oh, I got to do it. Like, so team go, implement, pay money, let's go, let's run. And it's like, yeah, but where does it fit? Why does it fit? Where does it integrate? And so that's the first thing I want people to really listen to what you said is like, what is the big picture, right? Like, how do all of your marketing strategies fit together? How do they then lead to what you talked about, which was brilliant, was marketing, sales, fulfillment? Where are the handoffs? What are the qualifiers? Where are those moments? How do they flow together? Like people don't slow down. They think, oh, marketing. Well, but what? We're driving leads somewhere, and then those leads have to close. Are we qualifying? Are we edifying? Are we educating? What are we doing to make the sales process easier? And then what are we doing to retain long term? Like I love that you're looking big picture, and we didn't just jump into like, let's audit your SEO. Let's audit your website. Let's like, well, we don't know. Like, we don't know what we need to do yet. We need to actually have a big picture plan.
Yeah. And then the other part, Devin, with that is I'm going to call it the math, right? Which for just doing this as long as I have, I don't know if you see this too. Golly, like we ask people about, hey, what do you expect your cost per lead to be? They have no idea. It's just completely arbitrarily made up. Okay, what's the value of your clients, like long term, or LTV is the common term that's thrown around. I have no idea, or it's arbitrary and they make it up, right? Because one customer in 400 years of theirs, bought the biggest thing they had instead of like tracking it to some degree. So the other part of vision and growth plan is math and like simplifying the math. And it's, I think, again, what I think you're very good at this from my experience with you. And then some of the better communities are simplifiers, right? But like, for example, one of our clients wanted to grow by $10 million a year. And, they're in a high value premium type service, right? Call it, more like SaaS and other things like that. So the average service is like 100 grand, right? For that service. And it's obviously spread out over time in that type of model, but it does average 100 grand. So if you do the math, okay, if you want to grow by 10 million and that's your main core service, and there's others, but that's the main one. Okay, well, how many clients do you need to have to add 10 million? Most people have never done the math that we find. It's literally 99.9% in this business that we've been running for over 14 years. And, another 4 or 5 years of the education companies I had that we sold, when we would ask, well, what is the math that you're building towards? They've never done it. And that's a very simple thing to do on a sheet. Like, okay.
Yeah. So do you go upstream then? So do you then say like, okay, cool, you need 1,000 clients or 100 clients. Then do you go, okay, what's your conversion rate? And
then we start backing it down, right? So,
okay.
But then the other part is most companies have another set of services or offerings, right? And then there's different ways to, sell those services that a lot of people are, they just don't think about. Like one of our, super, stories that we built, in a mastermind, right? They had a $25,000 a year program. We sat down with him. I said, well, where do you want to go? And he goes, well, I'm at about 67 members and I kind of capped there. It'd be great if we could get to 100, right? And so if you do the math, which we did together, I sat with him at a table next to his office and was like, okay, 100 minus 67 is only, what is that? 33 more new members. But 33 times 25 is about $1 million in extra revenue, right? And so unfortunately, we didn't hit the goal. And then I said, well, what's your other goal? And I'll get back to that in a second. He goes, well, I really want to start this other program that's actually 100 grand a year mastermind. Well, how many people do you think you'd want in that? He goes, I'd like to have 20 to 25, and then it'd be a waiting list beyond that. Okay, awesome. So that was his initial conversation, but he had never really kind of done the math. I go, okay, well, that's an extra $1 million a year. And then, 20, let's use 20 times 100. That's an extra 2 million. So we're looking at adding about 3 million a year. We did not hit our goals. We went from 67 over time in a couple years to just under 300, right? By putting, some of the other pieces, maybe we'll have time to talk about that, make this kind of work together in the other 4 pieces. And then we didn't launch the 100K program right away. It was like 2.5 years later. But when he did, he had supply and demand so it built up, right? He didn't rush it. If we'd have started when he had 67, 100K program, like, he might have had 4 people. When we got to 250, 300, plus all the buildup of the assets in marketing that get built up and the story and the credibility and the accountability and the reputation, it created momentum, because momentum creates momentum that I think a lot of people misunderstand. There's a timing factor of any service or product of when you introduce it. And I think another piece that, if I were to say, Devin, that people mistake in their business is the timing of their offerings, right? If it's off, like, it just doesn't, it's like when I was a kid, at 16, my dad got me a stick shift, and, in the old days, with these stick shifts, you had the timing belt, you had to make sure, and I had to do a lot of the work myself to keep the car running. And so if the timing belt was like a 1/4 inch off, this thing would like, it was like a Fred Flintstone ride, right? Kind of thing. So reverse engineering the math allows us to ultimately get a strong, clear path to be able to build towards, right? In what we're doing. So there's more to this, but like, reverse engineer the math and it helps, right? And it just simplifies. And also, if you have one product, core product, focus on that first. And then the other part, here's another part. Let's say somebody wants to add $1 million in new revenue, right? And they have a $10,000 product, let's just say. Or heck, let's take any product off the table. If someone wants to add an extra $1 million, well, one path to get there, Brian Tracy taught me this. He said, well, you could just sell one person a $1 million program. Right? I'm lucky enough to have a few clients that are in the investor space. And, so they regularly have people who will be a check writer and fund a business, and, they'll write a check for 20 million, not just one, but 20. That's a customer, right? That's a path. Okay, what's another path? So let's say we want $1 million. Okay, so one writes $1 million. We could have 10 that write $100,000 check. That's $1 million. Okay, now we just have 2 if we add those 2 together. If we go to 1,000 or 100 people, write a check for 10 grand. We got another $1 million, right? And we could start to see how this, and when we walk people kind of through reverse engineering some of this, what starts, and then we go to the monthly, because now you can break up 100,000 to, a monthly continuity recurring model, right? And so on. People start to see, oh, there's other opportunities that I've got to make this fit together like a puzzle. And I think a lot of people miss this. I think the clarity is in really mapping it out. If I were to kind of brainstorm around the math and like, what are the possibilities? And then also the timing of it. Dan Kennedy has a great quote, Devin, you probably know it. He says the difference between lettuce and garbage is timing. And that's with a lot of people's offers, and also how they go about their marketing too.
Well, and again, I want people to, we're 20 minutes in the conversation. We haven't talked about marketing tactics yet. And I think that that's critical, because I think, again, they run so quick. And when you get burned by vendors, typically you're running into the vendor relationship trying to buy something. I need social media. I need this. I need that, without understanding the big picture, the map, like you talked about, right? So your vision and growth plan, and then knowing the numbers, right? Like, what are you trying to create revenue wise? And then is that sustainable? You mentioned that as a problem, right? Like, what if that becomes a true statement? Can you actually sustain that growth? And is that the type of business you're actually chasing to run? Because sometimes you have this vision of, yeah, I want $1 million. And then to your point, you do the math and go, oh, I got to add 200 clients. Never mind. I don't want that, because I don't want to scale a team to that. Okay. So really you want to grow by 300,000. Okay, great. Now, if that's the goal, and we know the average client lifetime value and all these other things, now we can build a marketing plan that actually makes sense, because maybe you can spend more, maybe you can spend less. Like, you can't know what to spend and what plans to use if you don't know what you're trying to solve for.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And I think another factor to it in looking at a plan, right, is like, again, your plan versus someone else's. I made this mistake. I made millions of mistakes in doing this over 37 years. And one of the big mistakes is also coming back to the comparison factor, right? And also misunderstanding what's under the hood of other businesses. Like, for example, Starbucks. Now, depending on which statistics you'll go find out on the internet, my team found these statistics, and I'm going to use the one that they gave us, and there's a bunch of different ones, and they do vary a little bit. But Starbucks, lifetime average customer. Do you know what it is? Have you ever heard this before with Starbucks? It's about $14,000 per client. So I don't know about you, but my wife, maybe you guys drink Starbucks. The average lifetime value of a customer, apparently through the data out there, is 14,000. Some have it higher, but we found the lower of the gamut, about 14 grand. Now think about that business model. So what you just brought up is so critical, and this will tie to all of it. So now what can they, if they know the average value of a customer is 14 grand, Devin, technically, what could they afford to spend to acquire a $14,000 customer? What would you think?
Some percent of that for sure.
Yeah, right. Let's just say we take, let's say they're a minimum margin business at 20%, right?
Yeah.
So leave the 20% off, or divide 14 grand by 20%, you've got about $2,800.
Which is actually crazy when you think about, if you think about the per transaction amount versus the lifetime value amount. Yeah, it, like, my mind's blown a little bit, but it's a cool way to think about it.
And this is also how to, because again, their business model, if you copy and model them, but it doesn't fit where you're at, your funding, all these sorts of things, your capital, your team, like modeling that is a terrible, terrible idea, even though it's arguably one of the most successful companies in the world, right? So again, hopefully as you're watching this, you're getting value from architecting this. And again, if you never thought about it this way, work with Devin and his team. They can help you with what they do. Look us up. There's others out in the world that I hope that can help you. You look at your business this way, but 14,000. So apparently in the same report or other reports similar, Starbucks also, the average customer spends somewhere between 200 and 400 a month, right? So let's just say that they're willing to spend, and I'm going to make up an arbitrary number, $1,000 per customer up front to acquire through their TV, through their media, social, blah, 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 $1,000, right? And they know that the average, and I'll use the low number of 200 a month. Well, how many months before they break even? That's 500, or I'm sorry, 5 months to break even, right? On that potential client. And the factor is they can sustain it because of the capital and the funding and all the momentum they have. But if you try to model that, even though it's arguably very profitable and very successful, nobody would argue that piece of it. I hit my buttons here sometimes. So like I use my hands to talk. And so my screen sometimes will pop. Apologize for that. And so if you try to model that, but you don't have the funding, you don't have the capital to sustain 5 months of basically being, upside down, you're going to be frustrated in your marketing. You're going to feel like you're blindsided. You're going to feel like, oh, Mr. Marketer, you like, this is terrible. But in the bigger picture, you're actually winning, but you don't know you're winning because you're blinded by it, right? Because of kind of what you open up with, the expectation, Devin, right? So just because it works in other niches or other companies, don't assume that because it comes back again, what do you want in your business? I made this mistake. Right? Ultimately, it's part of the reason I ended up setting the stage, Devin, to sell 2 of my companies, is I got very clear on what I wanted and what I didn't want. At the time, I had 200 plus employees at multiple offices across the country. And I had outgrown certain things, my health. I was giving my family leftovers, and I was like, I'm going to make this hard decision. And then I up-leveled my systems, which is another factor of this, is get systems in place to run your business, especially from a marketing and sales point of view. And ultimately, within less than 2 years, I was able to sell those companies, right? And so anyway, you think of Starbucks, and then as you're watching or listening right now, how can you apply that to your business? And again, if you don't know how to pull this math together, it doesn't have to be perfect. Nobody has perfect math. Nobody has the perfect LTV. Anybody who says they do, by the way, they're lying to you. There isn't perfect tracking in this marketing stuff today because it's actually illegal. And anybody who says they have perfect tracking is also lying to you. So there's going to be variance, and some of this is based on good, strong data to give you good, strong quality information and best estimates, right? So that you can win and prepare to win. Anyway, I didn't mean to go off on that tirade.
No, that's an amazing tangent. And the Starbucks analogy, I think, is very real. I think it's easy to see because I was a little surprised. Like that's crazy, but it makes sense, right? It does make sense because we travel, we spend a bunch, we do it. But then to your point, as a small business, the urgency for revenue may outpace your ability to understand what's happening, right? Because you are investing, and yes, the lifetime value makes sense. The math actually does add up. But if you haven't done the math, then you're just sitting there going, well, I'm spending and not getting enough back. And it's like, well, actually, you are, but you don't know it. And so now you're going to get rid of this system that's actually producing, and everybody loses.
Or
I
has
don't
the
like it.
feeling of that, even though they are actually on the path to win. Like that's the crazy part about it, right? Um, and like for example, what is a company like Starbucks really good at doing? Basically gathering referrals because of the way they have community built their model. Like that's one of the things I love about your book model that you work with, right? And the partnership model that you make available is that like one of the best things to do, another misunderstood thing is like traditional businesses are typically very poor at referrals. Like one of my early mentors, thank God, his name was Bill, back in when I was 24 years old. So this is going back to 1994. And he asked us, a group of us, he said, "Hey, why do you run ads?" And I was proud. I was like, to get clients. I jumped in first. And he goes, "Well, if you do, that's why you're going to be broke." And I was kind of shocked. What up? And I was a little, and it was a point he was going to make. He said, the whole reason to run an ad is yes, get a client, but more importantly, serve the client, have them reorder, and ultimately give you referrals. How you can take your marketing and make it infinite done right is to make sure that part of your marketing has a reorder model and a referral model. That's one of the reasons books is such a good idea. Like we see a lot of our clients, I'm sure, I imagine you probably witnessed this in all kinds of industries too, guys. And if not, please tell me. But for example, a lot of people have some service, whatever it is. It could be training, it could be coaching, it could be a plumbing company, it could be a med spa. Like we work with clients in all these crazy kind of niches. And they'll go, hey, Gary, do you know of somebody that would be a good fit for our company? Sounds normal. Like that's kind of a normal referral ask. And then what people do is psychologically, and this is like thinking through the customer's journey, they start like getting confused and they don't want to let you down and they don't want to give a wrong person. They don't want to let down. And so then what do? They kind of like, no, I don't know anybody, right? Because they're not sure. But an easy way to get people to give you referrals, we had a gal named Allison who's pretty well known in the business growth space. I shared this with her years ago. And so the first time she did it at an event, she said, hey, we want to make an invitation to you. You're all here. You're all committed. You see the value of what we do. We'd like to offer you that we're going to send anybody that you would introduce us to, take the word referral out because referral is like marketing. It creates a negative emotion. Introduce us to, we will send them our book on your behalf as a gift, plus an $1,100 bonus package, which was part of her book month. She got 300 referrals. Some people referred one, some people did none, some people referred 9, 10, 12, 15. I remember talking to her after this thing and she goes, I had too many. I couldn't fulfill that many that fast. I didn't expect it to be like, I've never had that many referrals. Because you keep it simple. One of our clients, Dean Graziosi, says, you got to keep it so low the goats can eat it, right? And what's an easier ask? An easier ask, so compare. Hey, Devin, do you know someone that could get our mega grand poobah package for $100,000? Or hey, Devin, do you know someone that we could introduce and just send them on your behalf a gift of our book to be able to get along with an $1,100 bonus package as a gift?
Yeah, no brainer, right?
Right.
And again, one thing that's interesting, so Gary in the chat, he's been chatting with me on the sides, and one thing he said was it really thinks about like customer loss and retention, and that is actually a marketing strategy too. And then you just talked about it. Like actually, right? I think so often in the marketing world, people are so focused on the front end marketing funnel that they forget to market to their own people and their own infrastructure. And there's so much money there that you haven't even thought of. So again, when we're talking about marketing, what I love, again, timestamping to 30 minutes in, we still haven't talked about a strategy. What we've talked about is all the missed opportunities, the bigger plan, knowing the numbers. These are actually the fundamentals to good marketing. And I love that this is where we're staying because again, I think people when they watch the replay and they're tuning in, they're gonna be like, all right, Dan, get to the like what strategy should I implement? And it's like, well, it's not that's not what you should be asking. What you should be asking is why is all of this marketing that I've done not working? Well, because you haven't done the work yet.
Yeah. And again, if you need assistance, go, team up with Gary and Devin and their group, or find somebody or us or whatever. And, they can help guide you through, some of these things. Yep.
So let's go to where people are going to want to go, right? So we do the vision and growth. We've got that. We know our numbers. We know what the lifetime value is. We know what we're trying to chase revenue wise. We have an idea of what we can spend. Well, then what? What do you do with customers next? What is the marketing strategies that you're going to start implementing?
Yeah. So we recognize, Devin, there are 9 key phases in the business journey, right? At a simple level, there's more, but 9 basic ones, right? Have you ever heard, for example, that to get people to buy from you, they've got to know you and finish the statement? Somebody.
Like you.
Like you
Trust
and
you.
trust you.
Yep.
Okay. It's utter crap. It's a lie. And lots of marketing has been teaching this nonsense for decades, and everybody keeps repeating it over and over and never stopped and thought. We thought about it. And think about some of these weird things. Because I don't know about you guys, but I've bought a lot of stuff this week, this month, this past quarter. I bought because I needed a problem solved. I didn't know them well enough to know whether I'd like them. Did I have to know them? Yes, I have to know them. You have to know them. So that's absolutely true. Because if they don't know us, they ain't going to us. So there has to be some awareness. There has to be visibility. Got to go from invisible to visible, right? Makes sense. Got to know us. Okay. They've got to respect us. What does this mean? We can solve that problem. That's what respect means. It's authority, credibility. You can solve a problem. And I think another big mistake most people make, Devin, and I would call this bridging on both principle based and the tactical, is they don't really focus most of the effort on what problem am I solving at this time for them. And that's where so we got respect. They like when I bought some, stuff for our team here recently. It was because I needed to solve a problem. I found a company. Okay, that looks good on Amazon. I didn't know enough who the founders are or whatever. I could see that there were enough people that bought it. Okay, I have respect. They can solve that problem. Oh, and I saw the 5-star reviews, enough of them, or enough 4- and 5-star reviews that I could trust them. So they have to know us, they have to respect us, and they have to trust us. We're in a trust economy. And we have to get people through those 3 initial phases. The likability, I don't know about you guys. I bought a lot of stuff from, number one, I didn't know enough about the founders and the real people behind the scenes to know whether I liked them enough. So it was immaterial, right? And if I did come to like them, it was usually later on in the journey, if I happened to meet them somewhere where I could like them. But it wasn't the predominant reason to buy. And I see so many people, good-hearted people, coaching and advising, and they're like, oh, I got to build my model and put out all this content to get people to like me. Oh my God, like, no wonder you're going broke. They don't have to like you. They need to know you. They need to respect you, that you can solve their problems, and trust you enough that you have their best interest in mind when you do. And the likability ends up being a byproduct. It usually does ride along a lot of times with it. There is a likability factor, but it's not leading with it. And we see so many good people leading with that. And then the bridge is to get them to be able to get, hey, Devin, hey, Gary, let me try this. Right? So how do we do that in a mapped out model? So I'll walk through that. So we got vision and growth plan. The second key thing is, instead of trying to, there's a lot of people also teaching the same stuff. Go post 50 times a day and, stand in front of jets and in front of, Bentleys and, expensive places and all this stuff. They're trying to impress people instead of connect to people. And so those first 3 phases, know, trust, respect, it's all about connecting with people, connect with their heart, connect with them. Again, if you communicate that you can solve their problem, and ideally you can do it better, faster, cheaper, they're going to lean towards you in a moment. And that's where frequency. And so we call these connection campaigns. To connect, you build connection campaigns. For example, we had one of our clients, Devin, I think you and I may have talked about, his name's Joe. He had a manufacturing business. He had a very old school, traditional manufacturing business, warehouse, 40,000 square feet. He had virtually no digital presence. And one of the things we did, and we'll go through the full spectrum, but we really set him up to win digitally for a lot of reasons. He had a vision to sell as well. And we set up connection campaigns, and he's like, well, Dan, I don't want to post a bunch of time. I don't have time for that nonsense. And we were like, well, great, Joe. We can post like one piece of written content or video content a month, and we can put $1 to $5 a day behind it in all the different platforms and get you hundreds of thousands of views, per quarter, per month, and then millions over time. Well, in 18 months, he had over 3.5 million views to a whole series of video pieces, but we did it in bite-sized chunk that was manageable for a small team, small business, relatively small business. Well, he then sold his company. Part of it was because of the position he had that no one else in his space had at all in that type of industry. Connection works. Connection will always work. It has worked for 100 years, and it will continue to work well past my lifetime. Connect with people. And today, this is a way to do that. Build connection, content to connect, solve problems, communicate that. There's so many platforms you can do it for free. You can put a little bit behind it. That leads to the third place, because most of these platforms, of course, we know, Devin, is they're out there, right? And so they own if it's free, they own the customer essentially. Meta, Google, they own the data, they own the customer. So the whole idea is to move them from out there to move them here. And now you can start building a relationship, right? If we take our business hat off, I don't have a hat sitting here. If I did, I'd put it on. But we take our business hat off and think back to, again, human behavior, those 9 phases: know, trust, respect, to get us to try. It's just like, let's say I'll take you guys out. Let's say I was single again. And I met somebody and we had a little chemistry, right? And I said, hey, can I get your phone number? I'd love to have coffee with you, later this week. Okay, that'd be normal, right? And let's say she gave me her number. And if I immediately jump in with an opt-in box, a conversation that would go, hey, Mary, can I get your physical address because I want to follow you home? That'd be like creepy. And a lot of people do creepy marketing unintentionally because they follow a lot of outdated nonsense, right? And so, again, you put the human side of it back. We call it HOP: humanize it, optimize it, personalize it. Lead campaigns is to move people from out there on those platforms to yours by not just being someone of value. That's not enough. You got to be valuable. In other words, solve a real problem in this moment, in exchange to then, have them move from that platform to yours. And then if I contacted Mary in this example and said, hey, can I sleep with you tomorrow? That would be ludicrous. But people do this nonsense every single day in their business, in their marketing, but because they learned it and they modeled other people, etc. Instead of understanding there's a journey, 0.5% of people to about 5% in a given time are ready to buy now. And no matter what Devin does, or I do, or what Gary does, or any marketer does, you're going to have 0.5 to 5% most that are going to buy right now on a given time. So one, you got to make offers and do it in a cool way so you don't seem like the goofy guy that goes, hey, Mary, I know we met 3 seconds ago. Can I get your physical address? Or, hey, can we get married? Or, hey, Mary, you look like you're my soulmate. I know we only had 3 sentences together, but you look and smell and feel like but that's what people do in their business. They're trying to rush the sale. Not intentionally, I think. I think it's not intentional. It's just they've got a lot of bad advice. But so we go vision and growth plan, get clear on this. We go connection campaign. And by the way, all the most successful companies have all of these 5 elements in them. And all the most successful small businesses have these. So you can model big brands even on small budgets, right? So you move them from out here to here, and now you get into communication. Use things like the technology that's available. You can use your email. You can use text. You can use phone and or voice broadcast to communicate in a cool way and just make invitations to move forward, right? We call it peak interest, right? Other people call it like raise hand, right? Just peak interest and then move them to the next level. Hey, Mary, like this would be a normal thing that someone would do if I got Mary's number. Hey, Mary, how would next Tuesday morning be for us to meet up for breakfast and a coffee? That's peak interest. If she didn't respond, would we send her 14 messages? No. hey, you abandoned my cart. No, you wouldn't do that. You give it a little space, and then you might go, hey, Mary, still interested in getting together? Like that'd be a very humanized, optimized, personalized message. Same thing in business, same thing in marketing. So lead campaigns allow you to deepen the relationship, and then now because they're involved in your platform, now you can make invitations or pique interest to then move to the next step of your offers and ultimately get them more even engaged, which is the fourth piece, Devin, which is, I mean, I'm going to hit stop for a moment. We've covered vision and growth plan, connection campaigns, lead machines. You guys have any questions before we go to the next one?
No, keep going. You're on
Is
a
this
roll.
good?
It's great. Yeah, do
All
it.
right. So the fourth one are education-based conversion events. Now, it's a big fancy pants word to some degree, but it's to get us to think in terms of being valuable. And, hey, the most successful billion-dollar brands in the world use education-based conversion events. Apple does them a couple times a year. They do billions of dollars. The NFL, they're doing it every month in the off season, and they have it every week during the season. They're a billion-dollar brand, multiple billion-dollar brand. And most of their franchises are $1 billion. Starbucks, they do education-based events. And they do it virtually, they do it live, they do both. It's not one or the other. There's no magic button. It's just based on where they're at in the stage of their business, right? Can you go host a multi-million-dollar production like an Apple today? Probably not, as you're watching right now. But could you do something small virtually? Could you do, a 12 to 20 person type of gathering where you invite some of your best prospects together, live, virtually, or both, right? So education-based conversion events, there's about 75 different ways to do it. You can do it evergreen, which means if depending on the stage you're at right now, evergreen just means you could record it like we're doing this. This is an education-based conversion event. We're doing this live together. Then it's going to be repurposed and then live for as long as you guys don't have somebody go, golly, that guy was just off on all kinds of tangents with his ADHD brain of his, all this sort of stuff. So it can live for a long time. A book is an education-based conversion event, right? You create it once and it has a lifespan beyond 3-second little posts on social media. So education-based events, live, virtual, physical, virtual, don't get hung up on which way. It's a way, and there's lots of ways, but use it. Bring people together. People love community. They love to connect. And how do you create this repeatedly in your business? Heck, even, stale businesses like Home Depot do this. They host all kinds of clinics every single week. 5 people show up, 7, and don't get hung up on the numbers either. Some people, if you're doing webinars, like this is another common one that people misunderstand. Webinars, challenges, there's all kinds of names for these things, summits, etc. And get hung up. Oh my God, I only had 20% of the people show up. Okay, do you know that Sting, there's a historical story about Sting. Do you know there was a time when Sting wasn't known as Sting, and they were in the beginning stages of their career, and they were going around and doing their thing at different places, and there was a big storm that was out, and they thought about canceling it because they heard, there's not going to be a lot of people at this thing, but they were like, nope, we're going to show up because what? We're not an amateur, we're a pro, right? And they show up in their venue and they do this thing, and 5 people showed up. It just so happened that 3 of them were some of the biggest producers in the world that launched Sting. Never underestimate the power of one person, let alone 3, let alone 5, let alone 20. You're getting a gift to inspire, encourage, empower people to help break old limiting beliefs and help transform their life if that's the type of business you're in. We call it BOAT, B-O-T-E, be focused on the boat, boat. BOTE, the breakthrough, the outcome, the transformation, the experience they get with you, not available anywhere else. And if you stay true to that in your education-based conversion event, you'll have people that'll move in this journey. If you can picture that journey of they got to know you, they got to respect you, solve a problem, they got to trust you, have an intent in mind, to just get to a place to try you. If you will just take out trying to sell them, hey, Mary, you want to go, want to be my soulmate forever? And you get them to try it. Hey, let's go out on a few dates. Let's have some time. Let's build some chemistry. Let's go out to dinner. Let's go out to a nicer dinner. Education-based conversion events ultimately what happens, like it does for Starbucks, like it does for Apple, like it does for a lot of the biggest movies in the world, like it does for the NFL, like it can happen for your business, like a lot of our service business owner, a lot of our medical, functional medicine practitioners, a lot of our experts we've been able to work with. What happens is more people buy, and you want to build a buyer's culture. And I challenge you to look to how do you set your model up so you build a buyer's culture? Vision and growth plan, connection campaigns, lead machines, education-based events, and then that leads to the fifth step, which is go deep and implement more. Right? Add spokes to your wheel. It's the simple version of that. And you brought it up, Gary, as you brought. I think I sent a note to Devin, which is related to. That's where you then focus on how do you turn one client into 3, into 5 with referrals, and also the reorder process in the marketing, which is so it's missed so often, but so critical. So that's the 5 steps.
That's amazing. So let's direct people on where to go. So if they listen to this and they're like, okay, Dan, I want to lean in, how can they learn more? Where can they connect with you? Guide us on how to lean in more.
Yeah, I would say the simplest thing, because like you, I love books. So go to breakthrough3x.com/book. That's breakthrough3x.com/book. And you can get this book for free plus shipping. We've got some other options there as well that, are different tools and resources we built for you to help take you. It's the new model for exponential business growth without sacrificing your family, your health, relation. I've made that mistake, and I'd like to help you eliminate or minimize those same mistakes I've made in doing this over 35 years. So breakthrough3x.com/book. And for every book that someone gets, we also are donating 10 meals to feed hungry kids here in Arizona, because it's probably a big problem everywhere, but it's something that, because someone, like I mentioned, Jerry Sanders at the open of this show, who gave me ProCads. We also had families that donated us meals at a time. So it's something I've been doing for years. And, and so we're going to do that as well. For every single order, we're going to donate 10 meals to feed hungry kids here in Arizona.
That's amazing. What other platforms can they find out about you, connect with you? Where do you like to be connected with?
The easy one is email, right? Send an email if you have a question. My team will usually filter it first, and then, where it makes sense. I see almost every email that comes in. So you can go to help@breakthrough3x.com. We're on YouTube. I love YouTube. So we've got over, 400 hours of free training on YouTube. We've got a lot of people tell us that our YouTube channel is worth more than most of the programs, courses, and trainings they've ever bought for multiple thousands of dollars. And that is intentional. So you can go on YouTube. I know you can probably put the links in the thing and I get that over. LinkedIn, we're on LinkedIn. I'm not as active in being able to respond to those things. My team will filter those a lot more. Email help@breakthrough3x.com. Go check out YouTube. And then if there's anything we can help you with, send us an email. Like you, Devin, we're a great connector. We love to connect people with great opportunity. Like just yesterday, I had one of our clients, actually. He's a sponsor for the Indy 500, right? And so he goes, hey, would you want to go to the Indy 500? And I've never been to the Indy, it's a huge race, of course. And, if you're not into racing, watching this, no big deal. But he goes, do you also happen to know of anybody that might be a good candidate to be a sponsor of the race team? This racer we're working with, I'm looking to get him connected. I said, hey, I'll go through my Rolodex and I'll just think of some, I'm not really that interested in sponsoring a race team for Indy cars or F1s, but we can connect them to it, right? You're one of the best connectors in the world, right? So there's not really a problem that can't be solved through a connected network. And you've got one of the best in the world. So I'd say reach out to us, reach out to Devin. If you're looking to get any problem solved related, especially to business, we're here for you. Yep.
Awesome, man. Yeah, we will include all those links. They'll be below the recording. We'll drive people there and we'll make sure we share all that. What's one piece of advice that has nothing to do with marketing, business, life, whatever it is? Give me a piece of advice you want people to hear.
Oh, wow. If your health, meaning your home base, this God-given gift we've been given, is off base, it's likely going to impact your business. I was over 85 pounds heavier than I am right now. And, I finally got to a place where I looked in the mirror and I felt like I looked like more like vanilla ice cream melting than I looked like a human being. And so I started making some shifts, and, that's been quite a journey. And so, however you can focus on your health, it's amazing what walks each day. Like my trainer put me on a very simple, because I've had a tendency, Devin, I don't know about you, but I've had a tendency to get into extreme conditions in my history, and I'd burn out through that, right? Get injured and all kinds of other stuff. And so he put me on a plan that for me is customized to where I'm at. So I walk about 50 minutes to an hour and 10 minutes a day. And he has me on a high protein kind of diet mixed with carbs, of course, because you got to have that. And I was been able not only to keep it off, it's not a diet, it's a lifestyle. And so Fit for Life, it was a book I read when I was a kid. So it's just something that, especially now I'm closer to 60 than 50. And so being fit for life is really critical. And so I would say focus on that. And when you're healthy, personally, it does show up in your business in all kinds of extra ways too.
Love that. Couldn't agree more. Dan, thank you so much for your time, your knowledge, your wisdom. I appreciate you pulling back the curtain and showing us the process. Excited to continue this conversation in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks, Devin. Thanks, Gary.